Hello, everybody. Today, you have joined us on Futureproofing Now, the webcast, and this is our second season, third episode, and this one is a special one, at least for myself and my co-host, Andrea Kates. We are pre-launching our book, and if anybody has produced a book out there, you know how much sweat equity you put into it. So we're going to have people joining us shortly, but hopefully you'll have a chance to marinate over some of the things over the next hour. I want to introduce my co-host Andrea as well here.
Hi everyone, we're excited. It's the pre-launch of the book and we're going to be talking all things future-proofing next this morning, this afternoon, and this evening.
It's true, when we always on our global calls. Yeah, so we'll wait for, generally on these webcasts, people tend to show up within the first 5 to 10 minutes. So we tend to go 1 or 2 minutes after the clock just to get everybody in. We do have a lot to cover today, but we will leave some space at the end for questions. I know some of you joining us are probably either colleagues or friends, and you may have some things that you want to know in terms of the wizard behind the curtain. So we'll try to leave 10 minutes at the end for questions.
And we've also got some questions that thank you that the community sent in advance, and we will weave those into the conversation as well.
It's like a well-oiled machine, Andrea. Although we know those flippers are just paddling underneath so fast every time we do those, right?
That's absolutely right.
All right. I say let's begin. What do you think?
I think so. Let's do it.
So thank you, everybody. I know we've spent the greater part of a year working on a book called Futureproofing Next, which you're seeing. And we are 19 days away from launch. And so we're excited about just kind of getting the last minute details solved and getting all of our stuff online and being able to promote this. And we actually are launching on February 29th. So we figured special day, special leap day, means a special book. So yeah, we're excited about that. Andrea, any kind of cursory thoughts to begin?
No, one of the things that I love about the book is also what I love about today's webcast, which is that it's a community effort. We have been mostly listening and observing and thinking for the past probably 10 years about what it is that people really need to think about next. And so we feel like we've channeled the input of the whole community to talk about what we'll address today. So we are very grateful and excited about the community aspect of the project.
Why don't we start with the fact, I mean, the inside story, I guess, and why did we write this book? And we are both, I guess, second-time authors out. We're both from the McGraw-Hill stable of authors about 8 or 9 years ago, and we've decided to write a second book. Why, Andrea, are we this insane to write a book?
I start with a story. I have a very clear memory from 10 years ago when I was standing in the office of the CEO of a large insurance company, and very conservative company. And of course, the question on the table at the time, based on books like yours, Wiki Brands, was, should we get into the online world? Because here they are in a business model that had been very successful for many, many years, to be able to sell through a channel of distribution and to be able to not have to sell online at all, and very, very successful that way. And I remember there was a lot of conversation about, should we get into a new business model? Should we get into a new way of thinking? And at the time, they were equipped with things like, Michael Porter, 5 Forces, SWOT, lots of things like that. And I remember this visual of looking on literally a bookshelf of the CEO, who, once again, conservative, great mentor of mine. And there was this book called Business Model Generation. And what was interesting about it was I knew that there was a shift happening in the market because it was a different looking book. It was different shape, different format. And I also realized that it was a different kind of book because probably a few years before that, people wouldn't have been looking at books like this as the classic. Business Model Generation, I think, set a new standard in terms of how we think about bookshelves and books. So we thought, for 10 years that type of book was a great model. And I think that now we're inspired by lots of things we've seen, including, teams and teams of people and ways that publishing has changed over the years. We've been inspired to cut a new mold and really think about this book, Futureproofing Next, in a whole new way. So I think that that's why it's fun for us to go from more of a traditional and trying to literally be, you know, the new classic on the bookshelf. So Sean, what about you? What's changed in your world and your thinking since we last published books?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I don't know how these authors do it in terms of grinding out something every year. I've had 8 years to consider kind of what my new argument to the world was. And I think on this one, unlike Wikibrand's, my first kind of literary installment, I think this one is broader in context. I think it helps a broader range of people. Innovation touches everybody. And, you know, candidly, as we've looked at the innovation industry over the last 3 or 4 years, and we'll cover this in our presentation, it's underperforming, right? If we are all honest about ourselves, innovation and how it's currently constituted is not doing the work it needs to do. We need to figure out some stuff. And so we've spent, oh God, probably the greater part of 3 years actually either researching this question or looking at it from different angles. And certainly myself and Andrea being intense about it over the last year. So my hope is we've got a whole bunch of kernels of wisdom and foresight that, you know, I think we may have different benchmarks. My benchmark is this becomes the hand-holdable book that everybody takes to their next meeting, that's a practitioner or a change agent or somebody trying to support them and says, oh my Lord, I have so many dog-eared pages on this book and so many highlighted pieces because there is literary gold inside that I can actually take and apply to my regular day job. So that's my benchmark. Do you have a benchmark, Andrea?
Well, I have been inspired by some thinkers in scaling up and in corporate change. And as people who've listened to this in the past know, I really loved when Satya Nadella wrote the book Hit Refresh, because the thought of a company being able to innovate within its 4 walls while it's also running a large-scale business is really inspiring. And so if I were going to have one wish, it would be that Futureproofing Next becomes literally the book on Satya Nadella's bookshelf. You know, something of value to people at that level, but also a value to the people at teams, because we talk a lot about being in the trenches. And Sean, you and I are practitioners. So this is a practitioner's guidebook as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of our key kind of highlights here, that there's a lot of great work out there, a lot of academics, a lot of authors that have done work. We've really taken a practitioner's mindset to this book. So we do have a couple of housekeeping things ahead of time. These 6 icons on the right that you're seeing, we do have 6 kind of messages we want to get across in the book. And so those icons are representative of those. You'll see those throughout our presentation and webcast here. We're also using this as a précis to our book. And so you will get a version of this after seeing this webcast. It may not be the best for presentation purposes, but having said that, it's great for receiving something afterwards. So we'll probably highlight some of the content that's included inside here as opposed to duplicating a different PowerPoint. So why don't we get into some of the stuff we're looking at? And, you know, we did a bit of a decision tree here in terms of, you know, I think when we look at the last decade in particular, and we look at things described about the world around us, there's so much chaos, there's so much disruption. And somebody said it really good the other day where it's like, I think we got to leave this place of disruption and get to transformation. Like we actually have to do the work now. Let's stop talking about how chaotic the world has become. And so my hope is our book provides some level of hope for people in terms of making their company bigger, making their company faster, making it act simpler, and making it aspire to be bolder. And so we have a whole bunch of stats here in terms of, you know, how I think those 4 different parts of the innovation world really need help. And really there's a difference between the aspiration people have and what people would readily nod their head to and what is actually happening out there in the real world. So we're trying to bridge that gap. Andrea, any thoughts on this one?
Well, what I like about what you've just said is that since we're practitioners and since this is practical, I think that thinking about wishing that we were innovating or doing activities that feel like innovation, but not necessarily being met with the metrics that we're trying to get and the results that we're trying to get. We're lucky because we have now seen enough of the techniques that this holistic approach is really, it's a new point of departure. It used to be that you had to jump in midstream. Here's a team, make them innovate. Here's a trend, do something about it. Here's a cross-industry insight. What are we supposed to do to keep up with them? How do we find partners? Where do we find venture capital? How do we fund internal or external? We're lucky because you and I have had a chance to look at all of this and start holistically at this new point of departure where you can see the whole as opposed to what we had to do for the last 10 years, which is parts. We had to address it as a kit of parts. Now we have a holistic approach. So I think that's the only thing. And I also think, one of the things that I think is interesting about this is the structure, because part of this I would say is, it's partly a manifesto. It's partly a field guide for you to really, as we said, be able to just look at what it is that works. And we're researchers as well as practitioners, so we've saved you the time of having to do all of this field work, because we keep hearing people saying this hasn't been working. And so we've been really nose to the grindstone trying to figure out what really is working, talking to people on these webcasts, talking to people in our clients, talking to people on projects, talking to people in the field. What's really working? I think it's also this notion of a playbook, because I hate to use a sports analogy because I'm kind of bad at them, but the ball is in play, right? And that's what business really is. And you don't really know what the opposing team's going to do. I think I told you when I learned basketball, I was shocked that there was somebody from another team trying to prevent me from doing all of the drills I had just learned. So a playbook is much better because it's nimbler, it's more responsive to things that occur in real time. And we also, my book, Find Your Next, and your book, Wikibrands, we loved them. They had really good case studies, really good examples. What we learned is the day after it goes to print, it doesn't matter how current you feel you are. Literally 24 hours later, there's some new concept, Alibaba's done something, or Orsted has done something, or somebody's done something different, so that you don't know, by definition, you're not current. So this is also a resource bank that will be reinforced online, and we've committed to this live, in real time resource bank that we can all use and share. And as I said earlier, it's a community effort so that people can contribute. We don't feel like we're the only two smart people in the room.
Great points. I think we do bridge this gap. In order to have a new argument to the world, we had to look at the industry and tear it up a little bit. But I think a lot of our stuff is hopeful, it's helpful, and it's trying to get practitioners, change agents, people that work with them to get them actually to next. And so one of our core messages, and this is, I think, and it's our tagline, strangely enough, so it's probably one of our most important messages. It's we're looking at a future beyond innovation. And as much as I've embraced innovation, I remember I worked with IDEO kind of more of a decade ago, even in the early days, even back at university. Anybody who was in a strategic planning, and I must say we're standing on the shoulders of giants. Clayton Christensen just recently passed away, and certainly some of his work was formative. But really, bottom line, innovation isn't doing enough. We have to do something about it. And Andrea, I don't know if you have any.
I have a really strong opinion about this. I feel like it was probably overly ambitious to expect innovation to fulfill all of the expectations that corporate leaders and scale-ups put on its shoulders. It's unfortunate that we put every single thing that had to do with change or transformation or new areas of growth into this innovation bucket. And there was no way that people put in charge of this could do anything other than, I call it whack-a-mole. As soon as you get one thing right, there's another thing coming up, and it's like, oh, you have the new ideas that really capitalize on emerging technologies. Oh, you really are ahead of this exponential world that we're facing. Oh, you really have mastered artificial intelligence and ways to turn that into a business model. Oh, you've really figured out which startups have the best R&D. Oh, we really have this fantastic internally developed R&D that we can turn into a business model. But unfortunately, that whack-a-mole thing has put way too much pressure on people in charge of innovation. So we think it's time to move beyond innovation. And I think that the three things that we would say are, we know that there are, future insights, ideation, open innovation, design thinking, lean startup, agile. We've looked holistically at how you start. And the biggest thing that I think Sean and Andrea would say is, you match the right technique to the problem at hand. So you don't expect one size fits all. That's the first. The second is, as we said, it's integrated. And we really hope this is a book you can start from the middle. You know, you can say, we have X and we need to do Y. And so it's kind of a matching game where it's like, we have a leadership team that isn't aligned on its North Star. Okay, that's great. Start there. We have lack of commitment. We keep changing our minds. We have we have confusion about when we're finished validating. How much agile scrumming can we do before we actually go from an MVP, you know, a minimum viable product, to a fully scaled initiative? And then, you know, this notion of, we think that being honest, we can stop over promising because we have to be honest. Innovation can't do it all. So this panacea mindset, I think we can finally say, enough madness, it's not a panacea, and also be very practical about how people have succeeded. So, you know, what are your thoughts about that, Sean?
No, I think we've obviously written the book together, so I'm going to agree with you. Maybe there's some groupthink going on in that, but I would only add two other points too, and we're going to cover this later on. But you know, you mentioned something where it's like, and I think we're trying to improve the state of affairs in terms of people that lead this stuff. But the people that are allowed to lead or should be leading this stuff in companies is much broader than, you know, 10 years ago, I guess, where you set up a separate function over here. If we've learned anything from some of the newer schools of innovation, is it's much more broader. And I think the people that might find interest in our book are probably also broader as well. So I just add that as a separate point. And the only other thing I'd say is, you know, as much as we've borrowed and feel there are some good things around lean and agile and design thinking, there's some really good work with some foundational stuff. I find this whole industry comes in the front door of companies feeling very self-important and pretentious, and I have great self-worth, and how dare you criticize my approach? And really, I think what we've taken here is we've gone back to just kind of right at the level of ground level here and said, okay, what's working? And so I think ours is, yes, an argument to the world, but it's a quite malleable argument that says, look, your situation's different than mine. Use some of these as great principles as opposed to handcuffs in terms of how you go about your future.
Well, I love what you said about leadership, because really what we're trying to do is you know, acknowledge that we need a new type of leader, and we'll talk about that when you know, later on in the conversation.
I just pulled this one together in terms, I don't think it's going to show up in our book, but in terms of a summary of, I think, where people are at in terms of innovation. Oftentimes, even in Hollywood, they get characterized as those people that are in that rubber room over there that kind of throw things on walls and see it stick. I mean, this truly is kind of my 5-step pecking order here, where I think status quo, we know that's not an option. Innovation theater doesn't commercialize itself. Having this thing that we're going to execute 15 years from now outside of the space program, maybe, seems to be really impractical. I think the last 10 years, we've had this glamorization of startups, and we've said, well, let's just do what that 30-person startup operation is doing. And I think companies have started to recognize this is killing us. We got to do something different. And so, you know, we've taken an approach of finding what works. And so I think there's a smidgen of some of those 4 things below, but I think we get to a better place when we kind of galvanize and kind of glue on what the best of each of those things are.
So I'd like to insert something from the community. Number one is, thank you very much. Someone just asked the question, where do we get this book? What e-commerce, et cetera? So Sean, we do absolutely promise that we will put that information out there to absolutely every single person. I don't think this will be a secret. So thanks for asking that, but we'll be available where all books are sold, and we'll get you the links later on. Thanks for that. And I think also this notion, there was a question about what happens after the caffeine crashes. And I think that it's really true that there's kind of this zealous idea of the getting started. Some people call it, you know, like the fuzzy front end, or, you know, and this notion of the quote back end of innovation, as if it's like, you know, this consolation prize has been rough because it's not as sexy to actually bring things to scale. It's hard. So we think that now this is a book that can help us all get on the same page. I mean, literally just, you know, getting honest with each other. So back to you, Sean.
All right. No, fair points. And there will be some details in terms of where you can get the book. We're 19 days away, so you can't get it yet, but certainly you'll get this pricey, and yeah, we'll be getting it out at the end of the month. We looked at things, and I think we have 7 gaps in the book, but we were showing the 5 biggest ones here. If you're going to have an argument about how to do this better, you better have an argument about what's not working now. And I think the 5 gaps that I've seen is both in real terms and perceptual terms, innovation is failing. Even amongst 23 of its peer set functions, so finance and governance and a whole bunch of things that you might talk about at a board level, this gets an 18th ranking out of 23. And to use Premier League division talk, that almost gets you relegated in soccer terms. So, I think we've looked at innovation from 12 different standpoints. At most, I find companies probably deal with 2 of those in terms of how they go to their market, which is great that they're mastering 2, but we feel like this one is a generalist practice, not a specialist one. And so there needs to be some help in terms of getting over myopia. There's a speed and scale problem. Historically, I can tell you when I worked at Procter & Gamble in innovation, we did not care about how fast we were. We cared about how efficient we were. We cared about how validated we were. Whether that took 6 months or 12 months later, it didn't matter. Speed counts now. Speed counts, and having a process to get to speed also counts. And so execs are certainly viewing that as one of the challenges. And the 2 biggest disparities I'm seeing, the C-suite care about this stuff. If you have a beer with somebody in the C-suite, they will say, I am worried silly about what's coming around the corner in terms of the threat to me, and I really think we should be getting into a new business. Unfortunately, they're not making it a priority. And so part of our mission here is to make this bigger ambition, innovation a priority. And I also think, and I'll probably turn it over to you here too, Andrea, because I think one of the big eye openers this year is just what a powerful impact people and culture have on how innovation works. Like, this is not plan and stand back. This has to be trench warfare, and I hate to use warfare analogies, so I'll just say a much more collaborative view of innovation than perhaps historical.
I think it's really hard for leaders right now. We know that everything from Amy Edmondson's notion of psychological safety and being able to create an environment in an organization. And you and I didn't used to discuss, or at least I didn't used to discuss culture and leadership much, because we were much more interested in, what is sometimes considered more of the hard edge things, how you get revenue, how you build a consistent new product, how you bring a business model to fruition. So it seemed as if those kind of economic metrics were much more front of mind. And I think both of us have come around to realize that it's the culture and the leadership that can't be divorced from the end result. I think there's also a lot of really good thinking, David Kidder, in terms of the notion of long-term versus short-term, and some of the work Eric Ries is doing. When people are held to a short-term goal, sometimes it's at odds with the long-term capabilities. And I think that it's certainly not leaders' fault, but I think it's time for us to come clean and be honest about what the expectation is and what we promise in terms of delivering on that.
And I know it's interesting as we did this analysis, it shouldn't surprise us that we're looking for a new argument now. It seems like over the last, call it 50 years, there seems to be a different presiding school of thought in terms of how to do this work. I'm not too sure if we'll be that, but certainly if we look at the last 9 of these, it seems like every 5 years we switch our thinking in terms of this is now the way to do it. And I think there are things to borrow from each one of these. Having said that, in this presentation, I think we'll probably talk about some of the handicaps of these that make now Futureproofing Next maybe a little bit more relevant for today's environment. Any thoughts, Andrea?
Well, I remember 2 things. One is when I was in business school myself, and we were still probably at the SWOT analysis, 5 forces, 6 Sigma, benchmarking, TQM kind of world, and design thinking. And those were really important foundational principles. As you said, we build on those. But I also remember when I was writing Find Your Next and doing some of the research, there was a course that I taught to field test that work at University of California, Berkeley, in the business school. And someone raised their hand and asked a great question, which is, why, why is it that each of these approaches to business strategy appeared when it did? And could I give them a meta structure, starting with Frederick Taylor and sort of why we had these, the Ford Model T coming off an assembly line, which yields a mindset around assembly line focus. It is kind of a linear mindset. And then of course we have the notion of what tools we have to analyze with. So when we have spreadsheets that can't deal with fuzzy data, they can only deal with kind of cell to cell comparisons. It's really partly the tools we have and partly the times we live in, and partly, quite frankly, as you said, earlier, the market that we're in. So there's no need in a world where, let's imagine the Model T, you're kind of the only show at the time, or maybe you have a couple other competitors. They're probably automakers. The ability to project a market in those days, and someone in the auto industry at General Motors shared this with me a few years ago when I was working with them. And I said, how do you predict your market? And they go, well, you say how many babies were born 16 years ago. That's your total available market now, because that's who can drive. And, it was a much different kind of calculus. So I think that for each of these, they represent the times. We won't go into this because it could be a 2-hour conversation about this, but they represent the times, and what you solved for was really realistic, because you actually did have to solve for benchmarking in 1989 when your field of view was other people in your, if you were a bank, you could literally look at other banks and stay ahead. But as you and I now know, and it's the phrase I love to quote from Kevin Johnson in Brussels, who says, if you're winning this snail race, if you're winning a race that's not necessarily the fastest or the most nimble race that's available right now, you're really going to be far behind. And so design thinking we love, because it brought in the customer empathy and the notion that customer understanding was very, very critical. You couldn't just develop a product based on a feature that sold last year, and so you do it times 10 and you get 10% growth. What's somebody else's bumper look like? Those were the questions you needed to ask yourself. And then this notion of speed and the way that software was developing, influencing lots of things, not just software, in terms of agile in the early 2000s. So it was super important. At the same time, we loved the fact that Blue Ocean strategy had people thinking, they used to call it, outside the box, or, the Blue Ocean, where, well, I'm a circus, but I'm going to become Cirque du Soleil. Well, what we learned is that subject matter experts have a really hard time. If they're a juggler in a circus, it's really hard for them to conceptualize from that Cirque du Soleil. The breadcrumbs don't connect. And so we had the expectation that we could all magically do what a few people were good at, and we didn't have a playbook. We didn't teach people who were jugglers how to actually do that. We had the Blue Ocean thinking, but harder to do. And I think the same with lean startup and blitzscaling, what we've seen in lean startup. And I was talking to a friend at Mayo Clinic when we did a project with them a couple years ago, and we were asking people to pivot. So here are people who are really, really talented in a certain type of medical, capabilities or technology. And then we're asking them to look at a different business model and to just pivot, because the work that they had done for 10 years of their life and devoted themselves to wasn't gaining traction in the market. Well, that's an unfair expectation. That's not an expectation that's easily met. And so, Sean, what you and I have done is taken the best of all of these and looked at the needs for today's times and the research and the experience that we have with these practitioners today, and married that with the tools that are the best of all of them, plus we think 52 original ones that solve today's problems. Any thoughts about that from your perspective, Sean?
Well, I think you said it best. I think you went through some of the schools in terms of what we borrowed, and I think there are merits to all of these. I think too often people have a new argument and they just completely dump on the one that was before them. I think this is more evolutionary in terms of where we're going. I think the one thing about our book that separates itself from some of the others is we believe there's going to be a future that's much different. And as much as we can't predict it, we can certainly root our practices and how we're going to go about our innovation, knowing that change is going to happen and that we need to reflect that. And I think for the most part, most of these schools say, here's the current state of affairs. Let's presume the past will predictably move forward. And they only, if they get to the future, they iterate to the future. They don't anticipate the future. And so I think that is a key defining difference of ours. And I will give Andrea one of the biggest plaudits I could give, because I guarantee you, and I've asked people this, tell me, you're a design thinker. Tell me what that is in 4 or less words. And generally people struggle. There is no simple kind of I don't know, mnemonic or anything that kind of summarizes these. We'll talk about this in a minute, but we do have this simple thing called see, learn, decide, commit, which is what our book master process is all about. I don't think we need to go through this because I think we've covered a lot of them, and it may make us sound cranky, Andrea. We've got 6 different schools in our book, and on our website, we'll be also sharing what is the school all about, what its merits are. But here we've kind of just given the criticisms. And if I could land one on most of these, I would say the first 3 schools would be, well, they're kind of slow and they're kind of rigid and they kind of, don't assess what the future is all about. And the last 3 ones are really tough to scale inside of companies. They're great for startups, but they need to be accommodated for a corporate environment of over 50 people where, candidly, not everybody can think agile. So why do 5 million people have to conform to an agile process? Is there not some accommodation there? So
I think that it's the punchline of that is it's a new point of departure. It's not fair to expect something that's designed for a team to be the single religion of an entire company. And so I think that we have stretched the limits of expectations for a lot of these. And when you pressure test them in an environment that they're not intended for, they're going to break down. So that's the other reason for a holistic approach.
And I know in our last webcast, Andrea, we actually profiled, or maybe it was 2 webcasts ago, we profiled our 99 favorite changemakers books. We call it the Changemakers bookshelf. We're going to do a more elaborate version of that online when we launch the book, because we do want to pay credence to some of the people that we begged, borrowed, and stolen from in terms of some of their stuff. Really, ours is a curated set of things that, albeit different, certainly borrows heavily from the work before us. And, people love bingo. I think people love bingo. This is not one of those BS bingo cards, but certainly if I look at what people are trying to get at when they look at growth or innovation or transformation or change, it's probably one of these things. And we've actually done a lot of research to actually figure out what's the ranking. What are people right now using innovation to do? And I think that's reflected in some of the tools that we've actually helped create. One of the biggest things that we've diagnosed is, and we've spent a lot of time on this, the last 2 steps in our process. So see, learn, decide, commit. Decide and commit. We've probably overemphasized a lot of time on than we would normally, because 2 of the top 3 areas where things break down with corporate innovation is focused very later on in the game of innovation process, where they try to integrate and commercialize stuff. And so yeah, we focused on that in our book. Andrea, any thoughts in terms of how different this world is from the world we worked in 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
Well, I think that one of the things that's really important for all of us to understand and come clean about is that we can't afford incremental thinking. I remember even 10 years ago, people were talking about double-digit growth. That was always the goal of any scale-up or any startup. How do we have sustainable double-digit growth? And as we know from people like Rita McGrath and other people that study corporate growth, it's actually not been easy to even have corporate growth at double digits. So I think that that's really something we all just need to admit to, that it's really challenging just to do that. But the worst thing, I think, is for us to assume that incremental growth is the answer. And so once that's not the answer anymore, once you can't just do more, we've probably Six Sigma'd ourselves into perfection, right? I was with a group from Japan a couple months ago, and we were talking about the Toyota way or the startup way. That there's this feeling that what got us here, which is efficiency, certainly we want to remember how to be efficient, But now, you know, we're asking people to understand how to integrate artificial intelligence. We're asking people to be global. We're asking people to anticipate the next step from China, from regulatory change in Latin America. There's all these things that we have to really deal with. And we probably imagine that it's not incremental anymore. So you can't just take today and speed it up. And I think that that's really what is the biggest difference. We should not feel bad about it, but in the Mad Men era, we could just give them a better ad, a better slogan. In the efficiency, you know, TQM and Six Sigma world, we could just get more and more efficient. But you know, at a certain point, and you could have more and more ideas. You know, open innovation, just open up the thinking to lots and lots of people. These are all really good. The problem to solve for today is what we'll get to a little bit later, which is how to see, how to learn, how to decide and commit all four things at once. And that's the preview to what we'll talk about in a few minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to zip through some of this because I think we want to get into the heart of our book and then still have time for questions later. My only summary on this page here is we look at a basket of about 50 different factors. Some of them change every year, but it's our go-to benchmark in terms of how fast the world is changing. And versus 20 or 30 years ago, you know, there's a very credible argument that says we're at least 4 times faster in terms of how we operate. And technology is certainly guiding a lot of that, but it's also customer acceptance. We just learned in the last year that customers are demanding 17% more out of their companies. Meanwhile, companies are only able to deliver 2% more. And so it's not only technology that's changing, it's people changing, it's culture that's changing. I was quite glad to see that most executives have now woken up to the fact that what is the biggest threat that's coming in the rearview mirror? It's actually, most of them would say it's probably not somebody in my own industry now. It's probably somebody coming in from that side of the industry. And then finally, just societally, I think we're putting some teeth into this as well now in terms of not only looking at what's good for our profit and our people, but also what's good for community and the world at large, which seems to be, if you look at some of the major investment houses, really getting a lot of teeth in terms of how we'll be changing and innovating in the future. We are bringing new taxonomy into the world of change and innovation. Future-proofing is something that we think, you know, it's certainly been said before, but I think we're defining it. And I think it's funny. We've had this horrible thing in our book where we reference innovation, the type of innovation we want, and we're actually using 2 pluses behind it to characterize the type of innovation we're talking about, not the old style innovation that doesn't have the 2 pluses. And we'll also define in our book the messy middle, kind of our middle steps, where it's like, how do I get from my aspiration here to what I want coming out of the other end here? Nexting in terms of actually commercializing our stuff. And how do we get our leadership on board in terms of perpetual refresh and making sure that this is not a finish line, but something that continues inside a company?
I think the most important thing about this whole future proofing is a psychological state of, first of all, being really well educated and briefing ourselves. So perpetual refresh is all about really knowing new things and learning new things. And that's why we also love Satya Nadella's notion of, you know, being an organization that's really good at learning, you know, that we're the learn-it-alls, not the know-it-alls. And I think the second thing is that we have a responsibility as leaders to take a view of the future not as victims. We have a responsibility to envision this new state and to be absolutely tough on ourselves to make sure that we get there, that it's not maybe. We're talking to some people who are some of the big initial thinkers in design thinking the other day. We were working with them on a project, and they said, you know, even the notion of customer empathy, some people view as a little too centered on individuals versus the collective impact. And so what we're seeing over and over is that any of this future proofing has to be done with 2 things in mind. What is the future that we must or want to create? And then what are the ways that we can collectively make it more about just a greedy, you know, selling more products, that there's that new mindset that we believe resonates better with today's customers. And so that brings us to see, learn, and decide, commit.
Yeah, I mean, this is the real red meat, I guess, of what we're talking about in terms of our world. I think we've covered kind of our dissatisfaction with the status quo. I'll use Mark Twain's line. I think it was like, I'd have written a shorter letter if I had more time. We've taken a lot of time. Trust me, we've taken a lot of time to land on 4 simple steps: see, learn, decide, commit. I know, Andrea, it's based on some of your formative work over the last 5 years in terms of how we landed on this. Explain, see, learn, decide, commit in 2 minutes or less.
Yeah, well, first of all, we're lucky that, as Sean was saying, we've had 13,000 teams, you know, being able to look into what goes on to really succeed with innovation plus at corporate scale. And seeing is a lot of people literally don't know where to start. And so if you don't know where to start, you should not start inside your 4 walls, and you should not start with, what does Andrea think? You should start in a new place by looking outside of your 4 walls and by seeing things from a perspective of what these integrated forces are that are coming at you. The biggest problem we've seen with the C step is see and run away. So, you know, we talk about, you know, it's like, I can't keep up with this. I can't catch up. So you just run away. And so we want no ostriches. You know, don't put your head in the sand. Really take your head out, look around and see the changing forces, acknowledge that the technology is moving exponentially, look at things in the singularity and see that, you know, the world of mobility might not be the world of automobiles times 10%. It might be a different place. And so we want leaders to be equipped to see the future and then figure out how to get to that future they envision. So that's C. I would say, yeah, go ahead.
I should probably have just introduced learn. Oh, so tell me more about the second step.
So learn. So learn is really this notion, as I said, of mastery. And I really hate buzzwords, but one of my mentors is Joe Pinto, who, when I was working with him, it was at Cisco, now he's at ServiceNow. And he talked about, you know, this notion of expecting these buzzwords to somehow come into fruition, right? Come to fruition. And it's not about buzzwords. It's actually about learning things. And so we think that learning is just as important, because we say that people should be not just confident, like, oh, I'm confident that we can get to a world of connected automobiles. I'm confident we can get to a world of sustainable energy. No, there's a lot of technology. There's a lot of mastery. There's a lot of ways for your organization and yourselves and your teams to learn quickly. And actually, we borrow that a lot from Lean and from Agile, the ability to iterate based on new information. So learning is the second. Seeing, learning, and mastery. The third is deciding. And you know, we've been in situations, I don't know if anybody else has, but you come out of a sprint, you come out of a hackathon, you come out of a design thinking experience, and you end up with multiple really good ideas. And the question is, what should we optimize for? Now, that's a risky question, because none of us pretends to have a crystal ball. But what we know is that it's this dynamic between having options that are based on these new business model potential, you know, Amazonification or Alibaba-ification, but also being able to really be clear with the leadership team that it's much more impactful to decide and move forward with confidence there than to keep this notion of iteration until death, right? So at a certain point, leadership has to sit down and say, we now have enough of an MVP, we now have enough validation, we now have enough insight into which of these teams or initiatives we believe should go to scale, to give it the fuel to get to scale. And that's what we think the value of the blitz scaling is. Things aren't going to blitz scale by accident or organically. You actually have to have a moment of deciding. And that also then leads to committing. So it's see, learn, decide, and commit means that you funded the same thing that you expect to succeed, that you have leadership within the organization that takes some of these edge ideas and brings them into the core, or a core that funds something to stay at the edge with a lot of commitment, and this clarity around leadership, which is, it's not maybe we will, it's we must. And that's the difference for us, to be able to see, learn, decide, and then fully commit.
And having seen this up close now, I think there's people go, well, there's part of that that seems agile to me, or there's part of that that seems like just good business logic. But we were actually working with a bank the other day, and as much as they had that same registration, this all seems to make sense, but they hadn't codified it. They had kind of glued something together that may or may not work. Smart people in the room, it may work, but we've taken kind of the best of everything. We've actually practiced this with clients, and we've now codified it. And so I think some of the things Andrea was talking about, we can speak with some level of assurance just based on having put these in practice, which gives, I think, a lot of people comfort in terms of knowing, okay, this is not some test tube idea, but something that actually works. And this is our compass wheel in terms of kind of, there's 4 different steps, but there's actually kind of 2 steps within each one of those steps. And we've kind of defined it that way. I'll leave the visual to speak for itself.
Yeah, I think that the biggest headline on this, and then we can move on, is no more duct tape. A lot of times when you walk in, when you're working on something, there's kind of something that's been duct taped together, or there's a workaround, so you have this process, but then you have to tape something on or put a sticky note here or there. We really feel that. We walk into so many situations. We've worked with 200 teams on this. And you walk in and there's something that sort of works, but it doesn't really work. So we're hoping that everyone can come away with no more duct tape, that there's an end-to-end integrated approach where you can jump in where you want to start and get to your finish line pretty easily. So we can move on after that. Yeah.
Maybe a few less Post-it notes too, maybe, but we'll talk about that separately. As much as it's simple, we felt compelled to share the slide in terms of just the breadth of this as well. So we do cover off a lot of the different tick boxes that people are concerned about. I'm a recovering CMO from a previous life, and a lot of times marketing within the whole innovation sphere gets pretty short shrift. It's just like presumed we'll execute behind marketing. But at some point, they need to be involved in terms of how do we communicate and storytell what we're doing. So in terms of the structure for our book, it's going to be a 12-chapter book. I guess this starts to get into what does this little hatchling of ours look like. We've decided to have 2 bookend chapters on each side of it. Chapter 1, which is all about how do we get people motivated and just as angry as we are about the status quo and how we need to be better. Chapter 2 is how do we get started. We have a slide or a page within our book that talks about, well, innovation starts about 10 different ways. It can be from CEO dictate, it could be from a groundswelling of enthusiasm inside of a company, but how do we actually get enough discipline around that to not just have it die in a vine, but actually get past further? And then our last 2 chapters are about being learned and involved, and certainly they're focused on, how do we take Monday morning and actually take those things with us, and how do we keep people involved with us by providing them some insight, which we'll share with you later. In terms of other 8 chapters, they're all about the 8 constituent steps of see, learn, decide, commit. So this is really an architecture that drives a lot of what we're doing in our book. Now, I
have an insertion. Someone, Andres just asked if it's possible for us to send this webcast out afterwards, and the answer is yes. And you are absolutely welcome to share both the webcast, which will have a recording that everybody who signed up for the webcast will receive, as well as the asset. We call this a précis, kind of the short version of, we used to call it Spark Notes, just the short version of a lot of the key concepts. Yeah, back to you, Sean.
I'll summarize this in a minute because I know we want to leave some time, and obviously we've got passion about our book. 60,000 books out there in innovation. You type in innovation book today, Amazon spits that out. Surely we can't add anything new to this. And I think humbly, if we were to look at that, I think there's 3 defining differences in terms of our book. We got a different type of mindset. It's certainly middle ground between kind of business as usual and incrementalism and this crazy, the world of ideas and everything's possible, but nothing ever gets done. And so different mindset, different spectrum of interest. We've included a lot of what corporate life is into our book. It's just not, a lot of times these books come out as very tribal. You're a tech guy, so you're going to do a tech version of what innovation is. You're a research person, so you're going to do a futuristic view of the world. We've taken an integrated approach. And then finally, this is a book for people that work in companies above 50 people. If you want to run a garage operation or some kind of side hustle, you know, I'm sure things around lean startup may make sense, may make better sense, but this is tailored for somebody that actually is going to work inside larger companies. So I won't go through all of this, but just to reinforce, a different mindset, a different change spectrum, and a different challenge. Certainly we're bringing new intelligence to the table across these 6 different areas. 2 of them I would classify as inside stuff, talent and culture, company and strategy, and 4 of them are what I would classify outside. You know, and this is kind of this range of where we are in terms of, I think there are 2 different poles here that a lot of really sensationalistic books get written about. Oh my God, those people can't be right. Let's return back to something that used to work, or let's throw all the cards up and see what happens. We're trying to take a more pragmatic approach, and some of these tools below will be shared within our book. And so there's some gravitas behind what we're doing. This is one of our canvases that is still going through some minor last minute details, but essentially it lays out, you know, both the small steps, 4 steps, the mid steps, the 2 steps in between, and some of the tools and canvases that we're using to help people out. So it's almost like an a la carte menu that sure is sequential, but you don't have to do all of it if your company desires to be different. Any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I remember walking into, and if somebody from Lego is there, shout out to the Lego team. I remember walking into the Lego offices once in Billund, Denmark, and on the wall was this huge map, you know, and it was like their innovation process map. And we're hoping that this becomes your new map, that you put it up on the wall. We're hoping that we have t-shirts that say future proofer, and that we've got these things on the wall, and that we literally, you know, kind of retrofit every room that right now is just a whiteboard with something like this, so that people can just walk up and say, where are we? You know, you are here. We want to get there, so that everyone can go up and circle it and say, okay, we are here. We are trying to imagine. Or we are here, we're trying to figure out what are these integrated forces that are coming at us. Or we are here, we're trying to immerse ourselves in the metrics. And we can all have the same GPS, right? The global positioning for our future proofing. And at least we hope when we say get people on the same page, this is the page we want to get everybody onto. So thanks to Lego for showing us how to put a big process map on the wall to start off the, you know, like the planning of the battle scene.
And there are about 18 canvases in here, and people go, oh, could you not have focused on 1 or 2 canvases? So the challenge is people have different needs. And I think we were respectful of the fact that I used to be a corporate innovator. Andrew used to be a corporate innovator. It would take me 5 days to figure out one of these canvases in terms of what the best practice was and what I should be using. We've now minted them, all 18 of these inside, with impact on each one of our different steps. And I've just put a 1-word characterization there. You're seeing some spelling things in between here. I've tried to take all of our stuff that was lengthwise and turn it into square things for this webcast. So I trust you when I get this out. Spelling will be there. Formatting will be there.
Well, you're Canadian, so you can spell it any way you want to.
It's true. Center
you can
is
put an extra use wherever you want to.
Everybody loves Venn diagrams. Just we're including all, and I mean all of anybody that touches company innovation. Quickly on this one, Andrew, a practitioner's mindset. I think we've touched on this a little bit.
Yeah, I think here's the headline for this. Futureproofing Next really bridges the gap between the whiteboard and the trenches. There's so many people who think well, and there's so many people responsible for making it happen. And this is the place for the action to be inspired by the whiteboard, but really literally having the tools we need, not just the ideas, not just models, but these are time tested, as we said, 13,000 teams, 200 plus companies so far. And also this is supposed to be in real time. So what we're doing is planting seeds so that hopefully all the future proofers that have these, you know, retrofitted walls with these great process maps and these great t-shirts of being future proofers will be also feeding us a new breed of case study. So it's not just the academic case study, but it's the practitioners, what's worked over the coming 5 to 10 years. Yeah, so, right. There's no question that this is, that we care less about, you know, when we write a book the first time, you have to love your own ideas. And when you write a book the second time, you really have to love the people who apply the ideas. And that's what we're dedicated to, Sean and I, with this Future Proofing Next.
And here's our little Myers-Briggs of, you know, what's your need in terms of looking at our book? I think there are 4 needs of the readers that we have, and who are you? So depending on your role within the innovation, change, transformation sphere, you may have differences. I won't go through all of this, but I think there is something in here for everybody. This is what some of our book will probably look like. We're just finishing up details now, but as you can see, we're trying to go for something that is well designed, is visually pleasing to look at, and hopefully gets you to the answer quickly. And some numbers around our book, just to leave as kind of selling notes, I guess, maybe, but it is stuff that's being practiced by a lot of people. We've had a lot of research that's gone into it. There's a ton of stuff in it, and there's a ton of people that we're very, very grateful for, both companies and people, in terms of who we've gleaned stuff from. And then finally, in the last minute, I would say, you know, it was funny when Andrea came to me and said, we should write a book about this. We know a lot about this, and we think there's a next evolution. I'm like, I knew how soul destroying and cathartic my first experience was writing a book. Rewarding, yes, but when you actually do the work and it's Sunday night and it's 2 a.m. in the morning, you're trying to write something, it's really tough. I would say my one proviso when Andrew talked to me was, let's just not make this a book. Let's make this not about a book, but something else. And so, you know, the book itself will be design friendly and fresh, and it'll have a lot of serious stuff, and it'll have a lot of stuff that takes people online to actually learn more. But I think it really is a breed apart. And I think with all this different stuff, you know, there's a ton of stuff that goes beyond the book. We've got a guild of 66 people around the world that will be helping us and have helped us already on this stuff. We have a webcast that we do twice a month. We have research and intelligence that we're doing 4 major projects this year, the future work being one right now. We got a trend bank. We have stuff that extends online. We're doing future proofing awards and a changemakers bookshelf and a whole bunch of client engagement solutions. And in April, we're launching the 52 business models of the future. And we're planning on that being a kind of a playing card deck that are interactive cards that people can use. And obviously our community, the FN Vault. Whew.
There's only one question, which is, when do we sleep?
We don't. We clone ourselves. AI is helping us probably on this.
That's right.
To answer the previous person's question that said, where do we get this book? February 29th, it'll be located where all great books are sold, both online and in e-reader format or regular format. You know, here's some of the details. It's about 216 full color pages. It's us. We've gone through Ingram Spark this time versus kind of conventional publishing based on a number of interests. And our projected kind of hard copy price will be about $30. We've learned a lot about formats of books and how turning something that is the same amount of paper, but turning it this wise versus this way has an impact on cost. And so we've done stuff. And obviously we have 8 key audiences that we're pursuing now, both prospective readers and sellers and retailers and thought leaders. We're also looking at sponsors, actually. Sponsors, I think we're in some involved discussions with 3 or 4 different clients in terms of doing a mini tour of both themselves or their customers or what have you. So that's exciting to know that that's happening.
Yeah, we really want this to be the new curriculum, so to speak, for corporations. We want this to be literally like Business Model Generation did, where it's the book that everyone reads to get on the same page, puts up the signs, understands it, and uses it as this new point of departure for the new economy.
And that is Andrea knee-high boots telling an audience this is the way to go. I believe that's you. message us. You can find a lot of the stuff at futureproofingnext.com, both our venture and book. But if you want to get in touch with us at all on anything we've talked about, get in touch with us at hello@futureproofingnext.com. And just the last slide in our webcast, these are our next 3 webcasts coming up. I'm excited about scaling growth and innovation. It kind of returns back to my marketing and digital kind of growth sphere. We're going to launch our audit that's included in our book on March 10th. And so how do we audit whether a company is future ready or not? And then, as mentioned on our webcast, we'll do a preview of our 52 leading business models of the future. We have about 2 minutes. We said we're going to give 10. We may slip over the hour line.
There's a question that I wanted to address. Someone said, could we go back to the slide that said, who's this for? So I'll let you do the magic, Sir Wizard. And then, of course, we have to go backwards. This is like the classic archetype, but everything we do is a bit with a twist. And so what we would say about this is that there is, because of this mismatch between what people expect innovation to be and what we're actually able to deliver, this is a place to start, right? So who is this for? It's for kind of everybody in categories. So if someone's asking you for some blueprints that are based on real experiences from real companies, if you're a leader in the C-suite and there are people expecting you to get more and to grow exponentially, if we call something the Goldilocks effect, you know, if somebody on the one hand is saying, oh my gosh, there's this singularity coming and there's this huge future, and yet here we are today, where should we begin? You as a leader will have the confidence to be able to speak to both sides of that, both in terms of understanding what's happening in the future, as well as understanding that incremental change won't work. So there's a lot of places to go. And the good news is you'll have this whole deck after the website, so you can go back and rewind, and hopefully that was helpful to you. So thanks for that question, Katrina. And you're welcome. I just saw you said thanks. Thanks, Katrina.
So we can ask each other questions in the last.
I've got another question, actually. So it says, it says, when the VC money slows down, how will innovation be funded? I'll jump in and then I'll let you jump further. So we actually think that there's a whole lot of innovation that's being funded within corporations. When you start studying it, there's VC-backed innovation, but there used to be this thing, I don't know if people remember, there were R&D departments, you know, before A.G. Lafley said that we should start looking outside of our 4 walls, you know, for innovation, especially in technology. And so what we're seeing is that when you group all of that together, the new knowledge, that there's actually not as much dependency on just VC money for the innovation to be playing out these days. And that what we're hoping to do, the headline for this is to harness the elements of technology advances, the elements of competitive insight, the elements of what we're learning from this AI and machine learning, where we're getting insights, and be able to galvanize that into funding for the next advances, rather than just waiting for a classic. And I live in Silicon Valley, and I still don't think that VCs are the only way.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some respects, our audience is custom made for that message, because you know, I have a particular point of view that corporate innovation is the true major leagues. If you are trying to change a company that is that many people with that much potential impact, and you're doing a good job, I think your job that you've done is so much more, if not interesting, then certainly successful than somebody that has successfully taken a garage entrepreneur and turned it into a scale up and then something else. I think both are great, and I've worked with both people, but I think increasingly what you're seeing is what got startups to be so nimble and so much more successful, I would say, over the last decade over larger corporations is starting to change. I think the balance is changing back to, if not imitating the startup, then certainly changing it. And the one thing I know about corporate innovation is it doesn't necessarily rely on just how much capital is there. That's essentially number 1, number 2, and number 3 objective of most entrepreneurs. Like, how do I get cash flow? How do I make sure I'm solvent tomorrow? How do I flip this company so I can make a return? That is a completely different mindset than what a corporate innovator is thinking about. And so humbly, I would say corporate innovation, if you're doing a good job changing, growing a business beyond organic growth, my God, that is so much more impressive than some of the entrepreneurs that I've seen do great work.
So there's one last question, and it's actually it's a question that I'm thankful somebody asked. Thank you very much. This was a very generous question. So imagining that Andrea and Sean, we write the book. We're trying to give everybody, you know, the Bible and this new book for the bookshelf. So what if Andrea and Sean were working with companies? Do we work with the CEO of this large mega, you know, companies, or do we also come in and work at a team level? I think that's, thank you for that, because yeah, it's not just write the book. The day after the book, we also are out there in the fields, in the trenches ourselves. So Sean, what's your thought about how we leverage this thinking to apply it at the team level in companies, scale-ups, and corporations?
Yeah, I almost put it in 3 different spheres of influence. There's the outside world, just the curious reader, the association that wants some new kind of stuff. I'm sure that over the next year, given a book, we'll be doing a lot of exposure within that world. I think depending on how companies structure themselves and how they make decisions, I think both will be exposed to both the venture or division inside a company that's tasking themselves with extra change or extra growth and going outside the boundaries of what might be considered normal. Yep, we'll be working with them. But we'll also be working with CEOs that just have realized, look, what's working right now doesn't make sense. Chief innovation officers that, you know what, I have a lot of sympathy for these people, because it's one of the most new, I guess it's one of the newer roles in companies, and people say, oh, he's going to handle all of that over there, or she's going to handle all of that over there. And you cannot have all that responsibility rest on one person or one small little segment of a company's shoulders. And so for what it's worth, we'll hopefully be able to help them as well.
So there's another great question, which says, great stuff, thank you. Hi, Christian. How do you deal with sustainability and SDG in the innovation model? These are drivers of growth or lack of will that'll put, or lack of it will put companies out of business. Yes, I've been shamed personally in lots of places outside of the United States and in the United States. In the Nordic region, for sure. I remember teaching capitalism in Copenhagen and in Aalborg, and somebody kind of stopped me midstream and said, this sounds like you're teaching us greed. And I thought I had misunderstood the word, you know, like, how can capitalism be greedy? It is absolutely 100% of the places where we go. There's an acknowledgement that sustainability, SDG, we've worked with it in Asia, we've worked with it in Latin America, we're working with it in Europe and in the Nordics and hopefully other places as well, that the new reality is that the Sustainable Development Goals are central to the permission to proceed for any company, and it can't just be lipstick on pigs. And so woven into this notion, and we won't get into this because there's, you know, a lot of heartfelt acknowledgement of how important this is, the will for leaders to commit to a future and to absolutely, when we say commit, it means, you know, it's not like maybe, it's what is the future we want to create. And that has got to be completely interwoven with the future of the planet that we want to live on, the future of the generations that we're creating things for, the future of work, the future of technology is all part of that. So more on that another time, but absolutely that's part of what our realities are today. It's not enough to just sell widgets at a 10% margin and continue on like that. We live in a new world. So Sean, what about you? You want to close us out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think increasingly the performance imperative of your company will start to become a lot more linked with, you know, what we're doing in society. We've seen it with some of the biggest investment houses going, where they're putting real funds and money into it, and regulation as well. Like, a lot of companies can't do any of this new tech kind of change work or find new investment unless they tick the boxes that say, yes, we're doing good stuff for sustainability and the future. Just last minute. So we got a book. We'd love your support and ambassadorship. I feel like a little bit like public broadcasting here. And I think a lot of times we just present the details, but we'd love your ambassadorship of the book. You're our inner circle that have been on our webcast today. Certainly there's also, if you want to formally become that, we've got this group of 66 people that we're populating that are kind of global champions around the world. So definitely get in touch with us. Recap
and
on
we
that.
also, very quick, we also want to translate the book. So into languages that in places where we're already connected, Spanish, Japanese, Chinese, Danish, French, German. So if there are other people in those in different regions. And we were trying to do, we have a friend of the family here, Greg Sattel, who wrote a book called Cascades. It's about mass movements. And humbly, we would love to have a mass movement around this where it's not about Andrea and Sean, it's about the community and the world that we can create together.
Recap, there's a future beyond innovation. The change world has changed quite a bit. We need to change with it. See, learn, decide, commit, such a simple way to say this process. We have a different mindset, a different kind of challenge and a different spectrum of innovation. It's innovation that you can take to the bank, and it's more than just a book. It's more than just a book. It's a movement. It's a community. It's a new way of life. Maybe that's an overpromise. So a couple things. Thank you for being on the webcast. Sorry that we went late, but some really good questions. And obviously we got passionate with our own content. We will be back here again on February, I think it's 25th, talking about scale and growth. And Leap Day, pretty easy to remember. Saturday, February 29th, we'll be launching Futureproofing Next, and we hope that you'll be along with us for the ride. So I want to thank my co-host Andrea and Joanne, who's been manning the boards. And until we see you in the future, bye for now.